Thank you all for being here, coming out on the cold night. I'm going to start by breaking one of the rules of presenting, and because presenters are supposed to tell you why they're qualified to get up and speak in front of you, and I'm going to tell you that I do not consider myself an expert in this area. I'm just somebody that grew up in Gaston County, loves history, took time to do some research on it. Some of you who have studied Gaston County history may know it much more than I do, and I would love it to be kind of a discussion. If there's points that either I don't bring out that you think are important, it's more of a fireside chat. So feel free to raise your hand. But I will tell you, I've got a lot of information here. I'm going to try to move quickly. How the format that I've created is kind of a timeline historical. We're going to start from the beginning and go as quickly as we can. If you're coming hoping to find out about Gaston County from 1850 to the present, you're going to be disappointed because my presentation kind of stops at 1850, around 1850, because that's when we became Gaston County, 1846. I'm going to go ahead and get started. And like I said, please raise your hand, get my attention if you have questions or would like to add something that might benefit the crowd might benefit from. But we are, of course, the Museum of Art, Gaston County Museum of Art and History. I work with an incredible group of staff here. They refer to me as a local historian, but I don't like to consider myself. That comes with a lot of expectations. But I'm hopefully going to give you information that either confirms what you already know and hopefully give you some information that maybe you didn't know as we go through. And what I'm going to do is tell you how North America came to be, along with how America came to be. A lot of us know the story. I'm not going to try not to dwell too much on the front end. How North Carolina came to be, and then finally how Gaston County came to be. And if we have time, which I kind of doubt we will, but if we have time, I have a little bonus section on how our earliest settlers lived, what they wore, what they ate, what types of tools and all they had, what they brought to the homestead when they settled in this area. So let's get started. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so that's my starting point. And in case you want to check my references, that's the Holy Bible. That's what I told me. But now, since the earth has been created, let's go to about 300 million years ago. We have what's called Pangaea, the supercontinent. That's all of our current continents all kind of mashed together, and all the rest of the planet was covered by water called the Tethys Ocean. Then about 220 to 240 million years ago, that split into Laurasia, or La Russia, sometimes you'll see it seen, and Gondwana. These two continents battled back and forth for quite a while. They hit each other, they'd crush into each other, they'd pull away, they'd crush into each other and pull away. And what that created was our Appalachian Mountains. Because Gondwana would crash into La Russia, is what it's called here, and that would create an upheaval, and that would create the mountains that we call the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the Appalachian Mountains, we kind of take pride that goes from Georgia to Maine, but it really goes a lot farther than that. And we'll talk about how far it goes. But during all this upheaval, some of the things that make North Carolina, especially Western North Carolina, unique were created during this time, and we'll talk about that as well. Here's a good schematic before the continents completely separated, when the Atlantic Ocean was a lot smaller, but you can see this is essentially one large mountain range going all the way from really Texas or Mexico all the way up to Scandinavia. And so if you were to look at the geological makeup or design of the Appalachian Mountains, geologically, they're going to look exactly like the Caledonian Mountains. So that is kind of some of the proof, the geological proof, that they were all crushed together at one time. Now, during all that upheaval and all that high pressure and all that pushing and pulling, a lot of really neat things were created. The elements got together just right, that pressure was just right, the temperature was just right to create emeralds and rubies and amethyst, quartz crystals, and of course precious metals like gold. And that made this area very attractive to people, and it still does, because a lot of those early on, a lot of these gems and minerals were actually, as the mountains eroded, they were washed out and washed down into the streams and the lowlands. But a lot of them are still in the ground, in veins and hard rock and things like that. So people still come here looking for the gems and minerals of North Carolina. But this plays into one reason why this was a unique area as late as or as early as the 1500s. One of the reasons why the Spanish started to explore in this area is because they were looking for some of these things. Now, about 75 million years ago, when we had the continents, we actually split again. We had Larmidia and Appalachia, two subcontinents again, with the western interior seaway in the middle. That's why in Colorado and in some of the western states, they find sea fossils. That's because there used to be a sea there. Likewise, Gaston County used to be oceanfront property. 75 million years ago, we were oceanfront property because the ice caps had melted. The sea levels rose, and you can see the whole, pretty much the whole southeastern part of the United States is underwater. And that plays an important part in what makes Southeast important today. Because over those 50 million years or so that it was a sea, lots of sand, shells, sea creatures, lots of things died, fell to the bottom, got compacted into a really thick layer that was full of nice minerals. And then when it came to the surface again during one of the changes, we now see it as what's called the Selma chalk layer. Selma, from Selma, Alabama, because that's where it's most prominent. That's where they first found it. But that layer used to be, of course, the seafloor. That used to be the seafloor. And like I said, it's full of lots of calcium, lots of rich minerals and things like that. So that in itself is nice. However, from 50 million years ago to about 25 million years ago, climate changed again. And on top of that sea layer, that chalk layer, we had lush forest. We had lush tropical forest covering the whole southeastern part of the United States. And over several million years of growth, decay, dying, growth, decay, dying, they created on top of that chalk layer a rich, dark layer of soil. And that infused with the chalk layer, the Selma chalk layer, to make that really nutrient-rich soil. And that made it really unique even in the United States. It made it so unique that it could grow some key crops. It could really grow anything in the Southeast, but two of the key crops to North Carolina were cotton and tobacco. And those play into, of course, what's coming up and why North Carolina was important to the British Empire. Now, what it also created is something that became known as the Black Belt. All of this, remember, used to be underwater. Created that chalk layer. Then it had tropical forest on top of it. Created that nice loamy layer. So from southeastern Virginia all the way down to Texas became known as the Black Belt. We'll let our emergency crews go by. It became known as the Black Belt. And you can see where Gaston County is, right on the edge of that. So once again, we're in a prime position for agriculture, for farming, and that became very important in early North America, early America, and early North Carolina. Now, unfortunately, that the word Black Belt takes on a different meaning, or a separate meaning, a little later in history. Because also, if you look at the distribution of slaves in the Southeast, it follows that exact same pattern because slaves were typically used on the farms. They were used in the agriculture and plantations and those types of areas and along the ports and things of that nature. So once again, it models that exact same thing, which all started 300 million years ago. So it all plays into the timeline. And I promise you we won't go year by year to get to we're going to take a big jump now. We're going to take a pretty big jump now that we have the land. We know that we're a nice, rich, a desirable area to live. So let's take a big leap to 1021. That's when Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, comes over, takes a stop in Greenland, then comes over and hits the Maritimes of Canada, which of course we think was the first person other than the Native Americans to step foot on North America. And there is archaeological evidence, of course, of settlements there. There's archaeological evidence that they were there for some period of time. Why they didn't stay there, why they didn't move south and continue to develop that land or stake a claim, we don't know. But we do know there's evidence that they made it as far as the maritime side of eastern part of Canada. Then let's jump ahead another 500 years, and we get to what we were always taught. In the year 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah, and of course he didn't hit the mark either. He didn't really step foot on what we consider mainland North America. He was down in the Caribbean, but his discovery of the Caribbean opened the door to all the other Spanish explorers because he was flying under the flag of Spain. And this was his expedition flag, the Castile and Leon flag. Okay, so now we're going to jump forward even more. So about 8 years later, a gentleman that nobody probably has heard about, Juan de la Cosa, he was the first. He was a Castilian, a Spanish map maker and navigator. He was the first to include what was called the New World on a map. However, he didn't have a very good marketing manager because we didn't become Cosa land. We had to wait another 3 years before the Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, he actually called it the New World, the Mundus Novus, and put it on his map. And then it took another 4 years before there was actually a German map maker, Martin Waldseemüller, who actually called it America. So we weren't actually called America until 1507, and he named it after Amerigo Vespucci. So that's how we got to that point. Poor Juan de la Cosa. He got left out of history. Now that we have the land, now that we've discovered this new world, now let's look at some of the indigenous folks, the explorers, the hunters, trappers, pioneers, and settlers. Those are the folks who came next. And the first are going to be the Native Americans. Most of these really started as the Paleo Indians that came across the land bridge in Alaska and came down through what is now Canada into North America. But also, there's a lot of evidence that also there was an influence from some folks coming up from South America and Central America into the North America as well. And we think that happened maybe as early as 12,000 years ago, that some of the first Paleo Indians came across the land bridge and started migrating down into North America. Now, in this particular area, the area that would become Gaston County, it was mainly the Catawba and the Cherokee. In fact, the line of their tribal hunting grounds kind of cut right through Gaston County. Definitely cut through Tryon County, which is what we were two times before, and we'll talk about that. But all around us were other indigenous peoples as well. The Waxhaw, the Chirral, the Shawnee, and we have evidence that there was trading, commerce that went on between a lot of these tribes, but also fights, skirmishes, mainly over hunting grounds and things of that nature, natural resources and those types of things. And Gaston County was one of those places. In fact, for a short time, we lived out on Chapel Grove Road, and right across the street was a large field. Every time that it would rain and every time that gentleman would plow his field, we'd love to go walking over there because we found little bits of, broken arrowheads. We found shards of pottery, whatever it might have been. So we know that probably almost anybody around Crowder's Mountain, anybody anywhere in this county probably could possibly find some type of evidence because this was a very popular place. It was a very conducive place for game hunting, and it was also very popular because of the two rivers, the South Fork and the Catawba River. And not only was it popular because of the rivers, but because we had shoals. which are the shallow places where you could cross without having to have a boat. So the shoals became very popular places because game would also use those same shoals, but that's where the Native Americans would also cross back and forth too. Now we call this land, the land of the Native Americans, but the concept of land ownership was foreign to the Native Americans. They didn't know what you meant when you said land ownership. It's basically wherever they were, they would take from the land, give back to the land, and that was kind of their space. But if they moved over to 20 miles to the west, that was their space, but they didn't own it. They basically borrowed it. They were stewards of that land. That's how they saw. So it was really, unfortunately, it was easy for the government to start pushing them around, but also they were really confused with that whole idea of somebody owning the land. So that became a problem later on. But let's talk about some of the early inhabitants. We really find out that, like I said, 10 to 12,000 years ago, we had folks coming, the Paleo-Indians, and starting to break up into all these different tribes. There could have been as many as several thousand. We don't know how many different tribes. And each tribe, and tribe is really not the best term, nation, indigenous peoples, whatever term that you want to use, but each group had their own language. Many times they had their own cultures. They developed their own rituals. And a lot of that depended on where they were located. The dress was different. Many times that was due to the environmental situations they were in. But you can see the Catawbas and the Cherokee, the Tuscaroras were all right here in North Carolina. Gaston County was predominantly Catawba, and they were actually a branch of what we call the Mississippian Native Americans, because they all started right along the Mississippi Valley, and then some branched off and spread out, and that's what the Catawbas did. For that reason, we think the name may have originated from a Choctaw word called the divided or separated people, because they were physically separated from their original Mississippian descendants. But the Catawbas themselves called themselves, and I won't even attempt to do it in the native language, but they called themselves the people of the river, because they were non-nomadic. They actually set up towns. They set up what they would consider a village or a town, and most of those were along the river, along the South Fork, the Catawba River, and rivers around here. So they were the people of the river. And we think they may have inhabited this area for as much as many as 10,000 years before any Europeans ever came. And that particular group may have been as strong as 8 to 10,000 strong before we came in and ruined everything. So let's look at just a little more into the native folks that were here. Their main subsistence was maize or corn in this area. However, we were blessed with an abundance of game, small and large game in this area. So it was a very popular area for hunting. But you can see how by far we were not the first folks here. This entire land was inhabited long before Europeans ever came in.
I was interested in how many people depended on acorns.
Acorns? Well, we see this big group right here looks like they were all dependent on acorn. That was their primary, because I assume it's because it was available all the time. It's whatever was available, whatever the land gave them is what they subsisted on. And once again, corn apparently grew very well, and they knew how to grow it. And in fact, they taught the Europeans how to do that. So once again, this is just, of course, a very generalized, because they ate more than corn, but this is their main food source. Now, they called us something different than America. They called us something different than, these are some of the names, just a few of them. The great turtle, because we were seen as Turtle Island. We were seen as a large turtle coming up out of the water. That's also why you see terms like land surrounded by water. Here is the land of the rising crocodile. These are all different names from different groups of Native Americans. So once again, it had a name long before it was America and long before it was North America by the people who lived here. Now, the Catawba specifically, like I said, they were not nomadic. They did not move around like a lot of the Great Plains native groups did. They would set up towns or villages and then establish trading paths and trading routes. And people knew, the other tribes knew where to find them, where to come to trade. And those same trading paths and hunting paths and game trails were what the early explorers used to find their way through this area as well. But as you'll see here, they used what they had. So you do not see, there's at least one thing you don't see on here that a lot of people think you should see whenever you see Native American habitats, teepee. Yeah, that was mainly a Great Plains. That was the nomadic tribes that needed to be able to pack up and move easily. Here they used, because they were eastern woodland groups, they used the trees. So they used the trees for the structure, they used the bark to cover. They used pine boughs many times to cover over that, especially to layer in the wintertime. So once again, they used what they had, and it was probably very, very effective and very comfortable in those huts. And every one of the villages would have a longhouse, just like, strangely enough, just like the Scandinavians. The Vikings always had a longhouse in their settlements as well. So who knows if there was some influence there that we don't know about throughout history. But the longhouse was very important because that's where all their religious rituals, that's where all their important business was done, that's where the tribal leaders would usually congregate. So that was a sacred place. That was a very important place. That was the center of all the villages. How did they get around? You also don't see something that you many times see in pictures of Native Americans. What don't you see? Horses. No horses. Because there weren't horses. The original horses that actually evolved in North America died out about 12,000 years before this. It wasn't until 1519, I think I have a slide coming up, Hernan Cortez reintroduced Spanish Mustangs and Spanish horses back to North America. So it was a while. But these folks, because they were close to rivers, they had their canoe, but they also probably walked most of the time. Most of their travel was by walking. What did they wear? We won't read all this, but this is from an excerpt from John Lawson, who was an explorer who came through in the year 1700 to 1701 and basically captured the flora and the fauna and the native culture, the people. He lived with the Native Americans for a while. And he said of the Catawbas, unlike the Plains Indians, who were mainly in deerskin and those types of things, the main type of dress was very colorful for our Catawba. They had feather match coats. They had, in fact, it was like fine flower silk shag. They were new and fresh. They became bed very well. In fact, they would use that, what they were wearing, they would then pull over them to sleep on and sleep under. So their bed they wore. Let's see, some of the other sort are made of hare, raccoon, beaver, and squirrel skins, which are very warm. Others were made of the green part of the skin of the mallard's head. So once again, very colorful. Which were few sewn, that's actually S, sewn perfectly well together. Their thread being either the sinews of a deer or silk grass. And then the leaders in those groups would have deer skin. They would also have English-made coats that they traded. That would be one of the things, obviously, that they would get by trading with the Europeans later on. And that's what they would wear on festivals and other days of visiting. Okay, and here's some of the tools that you're all familiar with. What's missing here? No guns, nothing metal. That hadn't been introduced. In fact, that's one reason why historians many times say that the Native Americans never developed into what we'd call advanced societies, is they did not have beasts of burden. They didn't have horses. They didn't have oxen. They didn't have firearms. They didn't have metal. They didn't have use of the precious metals and things like that. So they did everything with what they could find, what they had around them. This is something unique to our Catawba folks, and that is their pottery. That was one of the things they traded, was the Catawba pottery, and it has a very unique look, that kind of burnt look that they still created today. And they still use that today as one of their main commerce items. Okay, forced migration. This is where the sadness starts, because the Catawba were actually our friends. They fought with us against the British in the American Revolution. They helped us fight off the Cherokee when Cherokee came into areas that we had settled in. Unfortunately, we had decimated most of them with diseases by the early 1700s. And then, because they did not understand that whole idea of land ownership, the government came in and said, okay, we want you to move. You know, you can have all of this area down here. We're going to take this area. And they basically forced them eventually onto a small reservation that still exists today. And there's about 30 to 40 families that live there. And it's in South Carolina, right on the Catawba River, is where the Catawba Reservation is now. Catawba wasn't recognized by South Carolina until 1973 and wasn't even recognized by the federal government until the early 1990s. But bright spot, Two Kings Casino. If you want to go gamble, that's the Catawba. That's the Catawba that owns the Two Kings. And of course, the Cherokee didn't really care for that because they're competing with all of their casinos up in the mountains now. Okay, so now the Native Americans are here. We know that, but now let's look at European colonization. The Spanish, of course, came up from the south. Most of the central part, including North Carolina, was under English explorers. And you may say, well, weren't the first two explorers, we're going to talk about them in a second, the Spanish? And they were, but they didn't stay here very long. They never staked a claim here, so we're going to talk about that. Up here is the whole mishmash. There's people, Dutch and Swedish and Danish, all up in this area, and then, of course, the French came in, and that's why they speak French in Montreal to this day, is because they were, that was some of the early European settlers. Okay, like I mentioned before, this became important later on. None of the native groups had horses as a means of transportation until after they were reintroduced in 1519. Now let's get back to Gaston County. These are some of the types of artifacts and the types of things that they hope to find from the 2, 3, 4 earliest, really the 3 earliest exploration trips. One from Hernando de Soto. He made 3 trips to North America, but the one that came through North Carolina, or what we call North Carolina, was the one in 1540. And he actually went up to almost where Morganton is now, but he didn't really settle, build there, spend any time there. What were they looking for? What was gold? But they were also looking for land to claim under the Spanish flag, and hoping that the people who lived there, the Native Americans, would become citizens of Spain or slaves of Spain. And that didn't go over very well. The Native Americans never made good slaves, and so they knew the land too much. They knew how to get away. There's a lot of reasons why they did not make good slaves. So, and the gold never materialized, so that's why the Spanish never staked a claim and never stayed for more than about 30 years. But the one who actually did a little bit of settling was Juan Pardo. This is Hernando de Soto in 1540. This is the Cross of Burgundy, the Spanish flag that he came through North Carolina on. And at about the same time, this is just a sideline, over in Germany, this was being written, the Rhine-Kostner Bible, 1564. Which happens to be in our collection here at the museum. And we bring it out usually at Christmas and at Easter and at times for people to come and view. But it's written in German, has some beautiful prints in it and things like that. But just to put it in context of what all was going on around the same time, Now, what's funny is even though this was written in 1564 in Germany, it's found its way into our collections right here in Gaston County. Okay, then Juan Pardo. He made his first expedition and established relationships with the Catawba and the Cherokee. And they were in a place they called Joora. That was the largest non-English settlement or non-European settlement anywhere in the area. Supposedly, there were close to 100,000 native peoples that lived in and around that area at the time. Now, you'll see it if you pull up the Berry site. That's the archaeology site up near Morganton. But Juan Pardo built as many as 6 forts in this area because he was hoping to claim this for Spain and build his forts in Spain. The forts being, once again, I don't know if it was Native Americans he was defending against or if it was just to show power and just to show authority. But it didn't work out so well. When he came back for his second expedition, it was 1567 and 68, he was not looking for land necessarily, but he really fell in love with quartz crystals. And I don't know if he mistook that as diamonds or it looked like diamonds to them, but we had an abundance of quartz crystals in this area. And so he came looking for quartz crystals, along with gold and everything else and all the other, but quartz crystals was specifically on Juan Pardo's list. And I don't know if that was from, the Spanish, throne, or if that was something he personally just was looking for, but that was in his notes. But it didn't work out well because by 1568, shortly after the second expedition, they did something to really make the native folks mad. The relationship soured, and there were 2 accounts. You can guess who gave each one. One account was that all the soldiers were killed and all the forts were burned, and they were, the Spanish were kicked out. The other account states that the forts were all abandoned due to the fact that they didn't find enough gold, and so the Spanish left. But they never staked a claim, no matter what. They never claimed this in the name of Spain. So that's why on that map you didn't see any Spanish yellow in this area. This was all the different large native towns or villages mapped during this time in 1584. This would be the one near Morganton, right here. This is Joora. And that's where Juan Pardo built Fort San Juan, the largest of the 6 forts that they had was there. And that's what the archaeologists are all trying to recreate now up in that area. This would have been some of the types of weapons they would have brought. So if you happen to be digging around and find something like this in your yard, hang on to it because it might be an old Spanish relic from the 1500s. And I will throw up a few maps as we go through the presentation just so you can see how the look and I guess the impression of the New World takes shape. Florida has already been named by 1572 because Ponce de Leon actually named Florida. It was Easter weekend when they thought it was an island when he landed on it. And so it was flowery Easter is what the name stands for. But this is what the New World looked like. And you notice this is the Sea of New France. This was the Sea of the North. So the Atlantic Ocean was also being claimed by the different groups that were exploring the area as well. Then we have the first English colony, the first attempts at an English colony. 1584 and 85, Sir Walter Raleigh, the namesake of our current capital, begins to explore and attempts to establish on the coast of what's now North Carolina, 22 years prior to Jamestown. And this is the flag that he flew under, and this would have been a ship similar to what he would have come in. This is the Queen Elizabeth II that they have down in Manio now, but that would have been very similar to the type of ship they would have come over on. We all know the story of the Lost Colony. They went back. Sir Francis Drake came back. They came back and they were all gone. So they can't really claim that as the first English permanent colony. But this is the type of map that he probably would have used when they were coming through and looking at the coast of Virginia and North Carolina, because this was the 1590 map of the Virginia coast. Then we get the King James involved. King James I grants the first charter to the Virginia Company of London in the region that's now North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland. A little later, we have the Plymouth, Company that comes in 1620, and that's the New England area. But that's all under the name of King James, which, of course, the Bible, that version of the Bible is the one that's very popular. 1607, the founding of Jamestown, named after James I. That was the first permanent English colony. That was the flag they flew under, and this would have been the type of map that they would have used to look at the coast. This would have been probably, the area Jamestown would have been in right here. Then we take another dark turn. 1619 is the first slave ship that arrives in Virginia. The first time that Africans have been transferred into Virginia. On the Dutch ship, the White Lion, came into Jamestown. There were 20 African Americans. They were used on the tobacco farms, traded for food and drink on the ship. But that kind of opened the doors for the transatlantic slave trade. Now, we didn't invent slavery. In fact, slavery goes all the way back to biblical times. But for many years before North America even existed, Africans were selling other Africans to the Middle East and to South America and Central America, and this just was a new avenue. This was just a new market for them. So it was not anything that we created, but unfortunately we participated. Okay, between 1585 and 1866, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. Only about 10.7 million of those survived because it was such terrible conditions and they were treated so poorly. About 450 either came directly to North America or through other countries to North America. The Lord's proprietors, once this was handed over to the Lord's proprietors, they became part of the problem because they encouraged slave ownership because they granted land based on the number of slaves that you would bring to work that land. That's one of the criteria they used to grant land, and which was very unfortunate. So there was an estimated in North Carolina, estimated by 1667, about 41,000 slaves in the province. You can see how they were used mainly in farm labor, the hazardous duties, the heavy lifting, but some were also skilled artisans, stone masons, brick masons, carpenters, and then a lot were domestic, working in the house, raising children, washing, preparing food. Most homesteaders did not have a whole slew of slaves. That was another mouth to feed, somebody you had to clothe, somebody that you had to actually find a house for, a place to sleep. So even when they started having larger farms and they would have slaves, you would rarely see them documented except in wills sometimes, and then later on in the census, you would see them as a number, not necessarily by name. So it's really hard to track back and trace and get the history of a lot of the enslaved folks. The slave numbers in North Carolina were actually lower than our sister states, our neighboring states, Virginia and South Carolina, for two reasons. We did not have a well-established plantation economy, not as well as Virginia and South Carolina did, and we didn't have a developed port. Wilmington was there, New Bern was there, but Charleston was bigger, and the ports in Baltimore and in Virginia were much bigger and better suited for bringing the slave ships in. So for that reason, we did not have the large numbers as our sisters did. But we were a very popular place for runaway slaves because we had a lot of land that was difficult to traverse. One of the prime spots, the northeastern part of the state, the Great Dismal Swamp, a lot of them had designated routes, and they had people to help them escape and hide in those areas. So North Carolina became a very popular place for runaway slaves as well. Then we get to the first Thanksgiving. We all know about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, all lived happily ever after. Then, 1629, King Charles comes on the scene. King Charles I creates the English province of Carolina, or Carolina. Comes from the Latin word carolus, which stands for Charles the Latin word for Charles, which extended from the Albemarle Sound to northern Florida. And this would have been, you could tell even by 1640, they had the coastline pretty well mapped, pretty accurately. They just hadn't gone too far inland by that time. But now it's still called the North Sea, no sea of northern France. They're out of the picture. Now it's just the North Sea in this map. Okay, and you can see there's starting to be some exploration and development throughout Mexico and the Baja Peninsula there. So once again, the Spanish were doing a lot of exploration and a lot of mapping and things like that down here by 1652. So let's look at who our 8 lords proprietors were. You probably will recognize some of these names. Edward Hyde of the Earl of Clarendon. We have Hyde County. We have Hyde County and we have Clarendon County. George Monk, the first Duke of Albemarle. Obviously we have the Albemarle Sound and Albemarle. William Craven, Earl of Craven, Craven County. We have Anthony Ashley Cooper. Now, if you've ever been to Charleston, what are the 2 rivers that come into Charleston? The Ashley and the Cooper come from there. Then Berkeley and his brother, who was the governor of Virginia, Carteret and Colleton, all still namesakes in North and South Carolina. We did have another permanent settlement in 1664. We're near the town of Plymouth or Windsor right now. That was mainly Virginia colonists that moved down. Albemarle County was then split into Albemarle and Bath. Bath County did not survive long, but it was there till 1739, I believe, from 1696. By 1670, April, the second English colony was created, permanent, and it became known as Charlestown or Charleston. Another map. Also out on the East Coast, we had the first signs of rebellion a whole 100 years before the American Revolution with Culpeper's Rebellion. They were rebelling against some of the trade laws and the taxes involved with those. And then other things that were happening. 1705, Bath was incorporated. 1712, North and South Carolina were officially separated, but they could not agree for another 100 years on what that line really should look like. 1718, our favorite pirate, Blackbeard, scuttled his ship. And then 1728, that's when the line between Virginia and North Carolina were created, which was appropriate because in 1729, the Lord Proprietors sell North Carolina back to King George II, and it becomes a royal colony. The British colonies were here for a lot of reasons. For the colonists, religious freedom, to get away from the tyranny and all the problems going on in Europe. But for Britain, for the crown, they had other reasons. They loved to claim that land and all those subjects, but also, if you look, the Kingdom of England, later Kingdom of Great Britain, they were at war constantly. They needed supplies. They needed timber. They needed naval stores. They needed tobacco. They needed cotton. They needed all these things, and they saw the new colonies of America as a treasure trove of those types of items. So they encouraged, because they could claim that. Plus, they could also charge them taxes for that land. This was the flag when they went from the Kingdom of England to the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707. We won't go through the names, but here's a look at the population densities during the American Revolutionary War. You can see we are at about 2 to 15 people per mile. So very sparsely populated, even that late. Because we had, once again, we didn't have a census. So they really didn't. Huh? 1775. Yeah, so this was before the first census in 1790. And so they really didn't know who all lived out there until they started taking the census. Starts to look a little better like the state that we are. We became the state in 1789. And this is what the flag we flew at the Civil War. This is what it became in 1885, and then the revision in 1991. But before that, we actually used this as our flag, the Hornet's Nest flag. That was the symbol, for North Carolina then, which of course Charlotte kind of adopted that. We were known as the New World, New England, the United Kingdom. But then during the Revolutionary War, we were known as traitors and rebels. and all the other good stuff. And it wasn't until 1775 that we started using the United States of America, or USA, officially adopted in September of 1776. Okay, I know this is a lot of information, but just looking at population, you can see that by 1850, when Gaston County had been created, we're at 900,000 people. About 300,000 of those are slaves, or about a third of the population. Gaston County had 8,000 residents by 1850, just 4 years after its creation. So any questions about this part? I'm going to fly through. I know we're really close on time. So,
I have one question.
yes.
It's way back, it was the flag that had Ferdinand and Isabel. I think it was an F with the crown and a Y with the crown.
It was the Castile and Leon. That was his expedition flag that Columbus used. In addition,
What's the Y for Isabella?
That's Isabella.
Isabella, Ferdinand and Isabella. That's it. Okay, I'm going to fly through this next part because now we're getting to Gaston County, what everybody really kind of came for, maybe. Sorry, I took so long to get there. Here's where we started. The Charter of Carolina in 1663. At first, remember these counties went from the Atlantic Ocean to infinity, or to wherever the exploration had made it to then. So we were part of Albemarle County, then we were part of Bath County, then we were part of Clarendon County for a very short period of time. That eventually became South Carolina, Clarendon County did. Then we were part of New Hanover County, then Bladen County. And that's actually the county I was born. I was born in Robinson County, but that's only because Bladenboro didn't have a hospital. So it was too small. But this is the mother county. 55 different counties were formed out of Bladen County. So Bladen County was formed in 1734, named for Martin Bladen, who was one of the Board of Trade folks then. Anson County, we were part of Anson. And then we were part of Mecklenburg County. And then we became Trine County, then Lincoln County, and then finally Gaston County. Yeah. So it took us a little way to get there, but we finally got there, named after William Gaston. How did the immigrants get here? Transatlantic was very expensive to start with. In the 1600s, it would cost $3,000 to $10,000 for a trip overseas, unless you were sent by the king or some other representative. By the 1700s, it became a little more accessible. Most people, or a lot of people, were coming over as indentured servants. The folks they were going to work for paid their way, and then they had to work for a certain number of years to pay that back. And then finally, by the 1800s, steam power came into play, and that made it a lot more, and more people were traveling across the ocean. So it was one of those things that just volume made it a little more, I guess, doable. A few saved enough money to purchase a fare. Most sold everything they owned in Europe to come. A common means was the indentured servitude. Some would work on the ships traveling back and forth until they saved enough money to stay in one place or the other. A lot of the married men would come over ahead of time, establish themselves until they made enough money to bring their families over. Then you had those who could only afford steerage. Steerage was the lowest part. Rarely did you ever come up on deck during that time. A lot of those folks died. You had some stowaways, and then you can think from the time you left Europe, it would be about 10 years before you were ever eligible to create your own homestead because of the trip over, the indentured servitude, and gaining your own freedom. The first folks in this area that used those Native American paths were the hunters and trappers and traders and explorers, but they would go back to the populated cities and talk about, oh, you ought to see the beautiful place with all the timber and all the game and all the great things, and that would be like a travel brochure. And people would say, maybe we should go settle out there. Then John Lawson came through, and he wrote a history of Carolina, and then he wrote A New Voyage to Carolina, and that was like a travel guide too that really promoted, some of the backwoods area. Unfortunately, the Tuscarora Indians killed him 10 years after he came through this area. And so this is what it looked like. We became, the royal colony, and to encourage Western civilization and Western settlement, the government now started pushing the Native Americans farther. At first, they let them stay where they were. Then it was, you could stay between the Appalachian Mountains, and then it was past the Mississippi River. And so basically they just kept pushing them farther and farther west. The Great Wagon Road is how most of the folks from Pennsylvania came here. That was both German and Scots-Irish. The Scottish Highlanders, the Lowlanders, Scots-Irish and Scotch-Irish, however you want to say it. A lot of people think that's maybe one parent was Scottish and one was Irish. It was more of a geographical thing. It were Scottish folks who actually moved to Ireland, lived in mainly Northern Ireland. An area called Ulster is where most of them came from. And guess what one of the large industries in Ulster was? Textiles. So once again, that worked out very well when they came over here. But then they moved from Northern Ireland over here, and they were tagged as Scotch-Irish. And then we had Dutch and English and some Swedish as well. This is an actual map they may have used in 1751, showing some of those Great Wagon Road. And then later on, because the wagon roads were ending in North Carolina, it became known as the Carolina Road. The farther south you went, the more often it was called the North Carolina Road. By 1764, it kind of stopped around Salisbury, but then later it extended even into South Carolina and into Georgia. We'll skip through this because just the time, but Germans, we had a lot of those come because of the crowded cities in the north. They were looking for farmland and an open land. This is why the Scottish came over, economic hardship, land clearances. They were kicking tenant farmers off of their land, so they had to go somewhere. So many of them went to Ireland. That didn't work out, so they came here. Religious persecution, Anglican versus Presbyterian. Recruitment efforts. They actually had agents in America that went over to Scotland and recruited people to come, like a travel guide. They were like real estate agents, going over trying to convince people to come in and live here. Some of the soldiers who fought for the British during the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, they actually liked it. When they came over here, they liked what they saw, and so they came back after the Revolutionary War. And then about 50,000 Scots immigrated to the colonies during the 1700s. What made it even better is in 1739, the governor of North Carolina, Gabriel Johnston, was actually of Scottish descent. So he sent the word back, hey, come on over, your kinsmen are here. So that's why we have far more Scottish and Scotch-Irish than probably any other group. Then there was two waves, one in the 1700s and then one in the 1800s as well. Here are some of the names. You may recognize this, and you'll notice the county. We were still part of Bladen County at this time. The earliest one that I've found record of is 1735 of Giles Hicks. Here are some other names with their Anglicized name, their original name. Hochstetter became Huffstetler. Then we have Freitag, Friday, like William Friday from right here in Dallas. Did a lot of different spellings of Rhine. The Costners, the Hulls, the Linebergers, Rudisels. Yeah, so these are just, and when they got here, they just Anglicized their name to something that and the one I don't understand is this one. All of a sudden, the Zimmermans became carpenters. And I don't know, maybe that was a trade thing. Maybe, yeah. What's that?
Zimmer translates to room.
Room, oh, so probably it was room builder. So yeah, so that made sense. So those were a lot of the Germans, but I've got several pages of these, and we won't go through all of them, of course, but you can look at the grants. You can look, the Kirkendalls. You'll see the Hambright. He was very famous for his participation in the American Revolution and other things. The Costners, the Robinsons, Leeper. Then we have the Hardens, the Armstrongs, Rutledge, Orman, Frondenberger, Aker, Glenn, Pesor. In fact, I'll show you something really neat about George Pesor here in a second. Here's some others. McLean, Beatty, still around today. Henry, the Henrys. Gregory's, the Alexanders. the Gullocks, Berries, the Springs. That goes to McAdenville. There, Holland, Reagan, and Spencer Mountain. Moonies, the Hoffmans, the Huffstettlers, the Titmans, the Stows. There come the Stows in there, Abraham. And then the Whites, the Oates, the Fall. And this is by far not everybody. These are just the ones that I were able to pull up pretty quickly. But now we're starting to look a little better. And this is actually a land grant that we have in our collection here in the museum for George Pesor, a 1775 grant for a tract of land, which we now know as Pesor Mountain, that area named after. But of course, back then, it was Baysour, Baysour, but that got changed into Pesor. But that was it was Tryon County by that time.
Where is Tryon County?
It doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
Because
Tryon is Polk County.
exactly, because
That's where my dad grew up.
right. Well, the town of Tryon still exists, but Tryon County doesn't because it was named after Governor Tryon, who was a British. And during the American Revolution, we didn't want anything named after a British governor, so they changed it to Lincoln and Rutherford counties. But with the grants came the taxes. That's, once again, planting those seeds for revolution again, because Newbern might as well have been England, because that was so far away from the folks in the mountains of North Carolina. Most of our settlers started at the Point, which is where the South Fork and the Catawba River come together. That was where the first settlements took place. However, they did eventually go settle around Crowder's Mountain and Cherryville and Lincolnton. There was a fort built at the Point because of the Spanish alarm. They thought the Spanish groups were going to come up and try to take the colonies back. So they formed a militia, never needed it. Spanish never came back. The growing communities, as they grew, Charlotte came into being about the same time that Tryon County was formed. It was no longer a frontier. In fact, people were starting to move out because it was too crowded, because Gaston County was too crowded. And once again, they were pushing the Native Americans even farther. So this is what we started to look at. 1 year after this map was made, that's when William Tryon became the governor. And in addition to the normal taxes, he wanted to build a mansion worthy of his name. So he had initiated an additional tax for 2 years in 1767 and 1768. And people didn't take too kindly to that. There he is. And there's Tryon Palace. But once again, here's Tryon County, made from Mecklenburg County. It was also called St. Thomas Parish for a while there. It was on the edge of Native American land, so we had 3 or 4 forts to defend us from Native American attacks. The Tryon Resolves, or the county seat, was eventually settled between what is now Bessemer City and Cherryville, in a little area. Some people may know it as Sunnyside or Delview, but that's where Tryon Courthouse was. That was the original courthouse for Tryon County. But then, of course, they built the forts in mainly Rutherford County. It was, that's where the Tryon Resolve, supposedly. There's some controversy over that, whether it was real or not, but that's where it was signed. And then, of course, it was dissolved during the Revolutionary War because they didn't want anything to do with the British names. This is Tryon County. So 4 counties in North Carolina, 6 counties in South Carolina made up Tryon County. First and freedom, you see that on our license plaque. These are some of the reasons why that may be so. Actually, North Carolina signed the first non-importation agreement. It was the first state action against the Crown, the British Crown. That was in 1769. Maybe that's where the term first and freedom came to North Carolina, but several other things happened. Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which of course some people are weary on whether that really happened or not. More likely, It was the Mecklenburg Resolves. That's a little softer than a Declaration of Independence. They just said, hey, we don't like what you're doing. We're not going to do what you say. Then we had the Tryon Declaration of Rights and Independence from British tyranny, not independence from Britain, but from British tyranny. And then finally, we have the Halifax Resolves, and that was the first state action against the British Crown. So North Carolina has a lot of reasons to possibly be first in freedom. These were the folks who signed the Tryon Resolves. You can see some of those same names again. And then our first industries in the county were not textiles. That didn't come around until 1848. So these were some of the first industries. This was the early map showing the areas where gems and minerals and precious metals were being found. Mainly the Appalachian Mountains is where they were found. But we had one big pocket right where Gaston County is. So mining popped up here. We had the Orman Mining Company, that's over in Bessemer City. You can still go see that. I believe it still exists. It did the last time I was over there. Then the Full and Wider Iron Works was basically High Shoals. That's what was in High Shoals before High Shoals was there. But he made metal for the War of 1812. Then it starts to look a little more familiar. Here we're still arguing over the boundary between North and South Carolina in 1772. Finally in 1815, I think we agreed to it. We go back to this again. We're still a pretty rural county. This was our first unofficial flag. Was the Grand Union. We wanted to appease some of the loyalists, that were still around. Then this was the Betsy Ross flag. That was the first official U.S. flag. Three very important battles during the American Revolution that took place here. Battle of Ramsor's Mill, the Battle of Charlotte, the Battle of Kings Mountain. Another explorer came through the area in 1794. That was Andre Michaud, and he chronicled the flora and the fauna and things of that nature. And then, this is something a lot of people don't know about, but in 1788, the government commissioned us to take the rivers and make them more navigable, because that was the main area for commerce. So they started digging canals around the shallows and the shoals to make the Catawba and the South Fork River more navigable. That didn't last long. They ran out of money. And then, of course, by the mid-1800s, steam locomotion was the preferred way. But, funny thing, one of those canals was the reason why textiles started in Gaston County, because Thomas Tate came down from Greensboro, found that canal already dug, so that's a perfect raceway for my water wheel. And so that's why he picked that spot for the Mountain Island Mill, the first mill. There's the Star Spangled Banner. First or an only flag with 15 stars and stripes. Because we would, right before 1812, we had added 2 new states, and they had a star and a stripe for each state. But that soon went back to 13 for the original 13 colonies. Okay, we had our own gold rush. We won't talk, that's the same year that the Thomas Ryan House, one of the oldest houses in Gaston County, was built. It still exists. You can drive out there and see it. It has 1799 right bricked into the side of it. So now we're starting to look a little more like what we think we should look like. 1800, Congress said that you can't import slaves from nation to nation, but it took 8 years before everybody got the word, and even after that, we think it still took place. This was the first official survey of North Carolina. It looks pretty good. There's Lincoln County. We're missing Cherokee County out there. We were participating in 1812, the War of 1812. The first textile mill, 1813 and 1814, was built just north of here. The Schenck-Warlick Mill, that was the first textile mill in North Carolina. And we were part of Lincoln County at that time. So then another sad chapter, the Trail of Tears, when Andrew Jackson told the Cherokees and everybody, you got to move west, you got to get out of here. And so that was a sad time as well. Now we start to see Canada, North America, and Mexico, and we're getting close to 1846. So hang on. Here we are again, minus those far western counties. Then something that hurt us for a while. they had the big land grab. Everybody head west, go find bigger lands, cheap. We'll give you, how X number of acres. And so a lot of people did start moving because our areas were getting overcrowded. And so the new county was established. 1842 was when it was first brought up. Larkin Stowe, who was the nephew of Abraham Stowe, one of those early settlers in the area. He and John White, a commoner in the House of Commons, they proposed it. Gaston County formed out of the southern portion of Lincoln. Supposedly, from one article, everybody approved it except for two people, the delegates from Lincoln County. They didn't want Gaston County to separate. Then Dallas, even though it wasn't established or incorporated until 1863, it was set as the county seat. Stayed that until 1911. The county still is 363 100 square miles. And then as of the 1850 census, we had 8,073 people. That's what we look at. Now, it took 3 years till about 1849, 1850 before Gaston actually started showing up on maps. They were still printing Lincoln County for many of those times. There's our namesake. Never stepped foot in Gaston County. He was born in Newbern, and he was very well respected. Very very popular guy, Supreme Court justice. Although he was a slave owner himself, he supported abolition efforts from the Supreme Court. He was a devout Roman Catholic, so he helped start the first Catholic church in the state, St. Paul's. And this is the only link I've been able to find to Gaston County. He actually made a donation to help build St. Joseph's Catholic Church up in Riverbend. It used to be called St. Mary's and Joseph's Catholic Church, but then it got shortened to St. Joseph's Catholic Church. But he made a donation to that to help build the first Gaston County Catholic Church. And he was the author of the Old North State, our state song. So he was very, very well respected. When I first saw this, I thought, wait a minute, his middle name is Joseph, and this is St. Joseph. I wonder if there's any correlation there. But then when I found out it was originally St. Mary's and Joseph's, then it was probably not named after him. And then finally, we were kind of looked down upon to start with. We were called the Dark County because we had more legal and illegal distilleries than any other county in the state. Imagine that. But then 1848 turned things around. The first textile mill, the courthouse across the street was built, the jail across the street was built. Dallas was established as the county seat. And then as early as the 1870s, the train started crisscrossing and we grew like crazy. We had over 100 textile mills by the 1920s, 70 years after that, humming away. Okay, and then finally, these are the names and the lineage of each town in Gaston County. Stanley started out as Stanley Creek, went to Brevard Station, went back to Stanley Creek for a little while, and then became Stanley. Henderson Shoals became Spring Shoals, then became McAdenville. White Pines became Cherryville. The High Shoals Iron Works became the High Shoals Textile Community. It was nothing more than a mill village, and then it became an actual town in 1973, our newest town. And then Dallas, 1863. This is not a town, but Mary Help became Belmont Abbey. It was founded in 1872. Garibaldi Station became Belmont. Wright Station became Lowell. Bessemer City, I don't think it had another name, but it was 1893. Maysworth became Mayworth, which became Cramerton. And then finally, lots of little areas that most people who lived here probably recognize some of those, but they're not actual incorporated towns. Okay, any questions? I know that was a lot, and I ran over, so I apologize for that. And as you can tell, there were probably 100 little tangent stories that we could go off of and do presentations just on slavery or just on the Native Americans or just on the American Revolution and those kind of things. So it was really difficult to kind of compile it down, but I appreciate you being patient with me. Thank you. Thank you so much. And if they ever let me speak again, I've got part two. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.